Dr. Rick Kittles getting it in, the renowned geneticist and biologist. Listen.
You have it. You're dealing with a pro when you take the time, you write down all these questions, you write them out, and he answers like 4 of them in one sentence.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, he's getting all the points. Can I ask a question?
Go ahead,
Well, this is a good question right here. This is the elephant in the room right here.
Uh-oh.
Specifically in the conscious community.
You was about to ask what I was about to ask.
I just need to know, based off of our presence in North America, the African Americans, would you say that we are the original Native Americans? Professor? We need to know that. We have several books popping up on the scene. I totally disagree with that, but I want to hear what the professional has to say. The one that studied on genetics. Can we talk about that? Are African Americans, Native Americans, are we closely related? I mean, talk to us about that, sir.
Here we go.
No, that is a misnomer, a falsehood, an outright lie. Okay, that's exactly what that is. We are not the original Native American. There is a history that Native Americans have, and actually it's disrespectful for African Americans to go out and say that they're Native American to the rich Native American cultures that have been here for thousands.
I totally agree. It's disrespectful. It's disrespectful. I'm talking to African Americans right now, or my Facebook friends. It's disrespectful if someone steal our culture and claim it, and claim that this was them. You guys get mad. Why are you guys doing it? Let's continue with the Dr. Kittles.
Yeah. I mean, Native Americans are descendants of Asians who came here, who migrated here. And we have the archaeology, we have the biological anthropology, we have the genetics, the fossils, everything is there, show and prove, okay? So there is no debate on it. We look at Native American populations. They were at one point very large with the settlement and the arrival and settlement of Europeans. Those populations were brought down to very few numbers. And so the genetic diversity, the biological diversity, the cultural diversity was lost, okay? But they were not of recent African descent, okay? Those Native Americans were not. Now, for some reason, there are African Americans who are here who want to claim this connection with Native Americans. I don't know for what, outside of maybe trying to get some money from casinos or something. I don't know, but they want to have this connection with Native Americans, and it's funny because it's almost like we are the Native Americans, and so whoever was here or whatever history that you can show coming from Asia just wasn't true. I mean, it's even more shocking that you would even say that. But I also don't understand why a black person would want to be anything other than African. Okay, that is the real deep sort of issue that has to be addressed.
It's shame. It's shame. These African Americans, a lot of African Americans who supposedly so-called woke in the conscious community, don't want to be African. They're not woke. They're ashamed of the history. They think they are something else. You're African.
By those individuals who continue to argue. I mean, they continue to argue this point. Now, I'm not going to say that no black folk came here when the Europeans came here early on, Columbus and all that stuff, right? Because I'm sure there was black folk on those ships. Mm-hmm. I'm almost positive that they were black folk. I'm even suggesting that some of them could have been Moors from Spain, okay? But there was no wholesale movement of black folk to the New World and then contribute all of what the Native Americans did.
No wholesale movement. No, basically what he's saying is there's no movement of people from West Africa, even ancient Egypt, East Africa, traveling to the Americas. That is a falsehood. The Egyptians never recorded or wrote about that. West Africans never recorded or wrote about that. They never traveled to the Americas. God damn.
And for some reason, that was lost too, I guess, in the history. That, you know, it was the black experience that contributed to the Native American history. I don't know, but I'm just saying there is no evidence of this wholesale movement of people of West and Central African descent being here before the transatlantic slave trade. So,
and that's why since July it's been a $2,500 offer for scientific proof of any one of us African Americans being in the Americas prior to the slave trade. There's no proof. He just told you anthropological proof, archaeology proof, biological proof, genetic proof, fossil records. We have none of that proof. The proof that they have of all that shows that we were not there. You guys are being wishful. Listen to the doctor.
The African American community that's there today came from, we are descendants. I'm going to say this really just clear, okay? The bulk of African Americans are descendants of enslaved Africans from West and Central Africa. That's it.
Don't get no much simpler than that. But since Brother Unc wanted to crank it up, you know, let's go all the way into it. Dr. Rick, talk to us about the OLMEC civilization. And are these people genetically African?
I told y'all months ago, the Olmecs were not us. They were not an African people. Ivan Van Sertima made a mistake and got the entire Afrocentric community thinking the Olmec heads are us. He based his information in the 70s off of features. Because it looks like a nose. It looks like this. It looks like. That's called features. That's called lookership. It's not his fault. I don't think his intent was bad. But since the 70s, the genome has been mapped. Right? And now we can use science to determine what's real and separate the jive from the live. Dr. Kittles is separating the jive from the live, right? He's giving you the live. Let's go.
Look, I haven't studied the OLMECs. I've seen articles, I've seen pictures, I've seen a lot of that. One of the things that I think we also have to be clear on, and this is what I call, it's not just me, a lot of my colleagues call this racial thinking, okay? Racial thinking is also typological thinking, meaning
what he's about to say is what I've been saying for months. I got posts on this saying this. I said it's racial thinking, meaning we've got engulfed with biased scholarships. We're studying Mesoamerican history from an African historian. It's like I'm not going to go to an Arab historian to learn about Chinese history. That's not his lane. We messed up taking on biased scholarship of our master teachers. And I'm not bashing Ivan Van Sertima. I love him. And I fell asleep listening to his lectures more than any of y'all. So shut your mouth. He was just wrong about the OLMEC thing and the Americas. That's all. But everything else he was cool with. But let's go.
There are these types that human populations adhere to. You're within one of these types. You're either Native American type, Asian, European type, and then they have different classes of Europeans, East, West, Scandinavian, Mediterranean. And then you have Africans, right? The stereotypic African, right? And so you see some pictures or some sculptures or some art of individuals that might resemble some West Africans. And you say, oh, those are Africans. That's typological or racial thinking. You're assuming that those Native Americans, the OLMECs, didn't have variation in terms of their phenotype. All
Phenotype meaning
have
features.
Variation in their phenotype. You can see Asian influences in Europeans. You can see even African influence in Europeans in terms of their phenotypes, their physical features. So no, I haven't bought into that OLMEC thing, and I don't believe it. I think that those are some broad-nosed, big-lipped Native Americans.
Facts. Facts.
I just want to go on record and say I did not probe Mr. Kittles for any responses prior to him coming on the show. because Dr. Kittles, the reason why I'm saying this is because they're going to say, he sounded just like the Ahmed Squad. I know the Ahmed Squad told him what to say before he came on the show. No, we spoke on the phone one time and multiple times.
By the way, that's Ben, Black Panther nickname from the Ahmed Squad, Mossy Warrior.
Through message.
Right.
We didn't tell this brother what to say. We didn't tell this brother what to think. We didn't give him the answer. He didn't even know the questions we were going to ask.
Right. Right. I did. That's the good thing. That's the good part is that this is all fluid and live. Right.
Right.
So it's interesting because we've had some African.
Let me go to the Dawes Rolls question and the Freeman and the 5 civilized tribes that he touched on. Just bear with me because I'm on this little tablet and I gotta kind of skip and figure out what the minute mark is. The 121 minute mark. Hold on.
I don't even know who this person is, but a friend of mine wants me to ask it, so I'm going to ask you. What were the test results of Cherokee Freedman? Do you know that person?
Yeah. No, you said it's a friend of yours, but you don't know who it is.
No, I don't know who Cherokee Freedman is, but the friend of mine asked me to ask you the question.
Oh, okay. That was kind of weird.
So, before he goes in on this, I had read the article a month ago. Dr. Kittles, the geneticist, he's the founder of Ancestry.com. He's the one who was going back and forth to court with the freemen who were seeking their reparations and benefits. They wanted him to do the DNA testing on the freemen and go to court with the information. So he's very familiar with the freemen, the Cherokees, Choctaws, and all the enslavement of Africans that the 5 civilized tribes did. Because out of 500 tribes, approximately, only 5 of the tribes had slaves. And those are the 5 tribes that most African Americans claim to be connected to, like Choctaw, Cherokee, Chickasaw, and a few others. They claim because they were slaves of them people. But here goes the breakdown of the freedmen. No, the freedmen and a lot of African Americans on the Dawes Rolls are not Native American by blood. Only by being Cherokee citizens, Chickasaw citizens, or Choctaw citizens. And, check it out.
I really get confused.
So, yes, the question deals with a study that I did looking at the freedmen community in Oklahoma. The freedmen community is a community of people of African descent who were part of those 5 so-called civilized tribes that were part of that Trail of Tears from
I say so-called civilized too, because the word civilized tribes, like the others, which I say the other 495, like they weren't civilized. You know what I mean? They just demonize them. The civilized tribes. I guess the other ones are uncivilized. Come on now.
Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, marching into Oklahoma to the reservations. Their land was stolen. Their communities were devastated. And many of them had, many of those Native American communities had relationships with to some extent, with black folk, meaning they either had slaves like the Choctaw or Chickasaw, or they had them in their organization in terms of leadership like the Seminole, or they just were a part of their community and helped stabilize them, in particular during this time of instability during that Trail of Tears. Imagine that. It was very hard for those communities to go through that period, but African Americans helped stabilize those communities. In early 1990s, the federal government gave them, those 5 tribes, reparations for the Trail of Tears, upwards of like $40 million each or something like that. First thing that they did, those tribes, was kick out the black folk. And they said, "Oh, you're not really Native American. You just hung out with us, and we can't get you this money." So the freedmen, they called them freedmen community, the black freedmen, which were part of those. They were actually on the rolls. Some of them were on the rolls. Their families were on the rolls. And they got kicked off. They then sued for some of the rights to that money from reparations. Now, at the time, these nations, once they got that money, they started buying up property, developing real estate, casinos. I tell folk all the time, they went from ashy to classy, overnight, really, because, they had the forest wealth, forest health, and then, with this money, they then built up their community. And in many cases, the blacks were turned away from those communities. So I went into Oklahoma. They wanted me to do some testing of the freedmen to see if they had Native American genetic ancestry, and maybe they could use that information in court to prove that they were part of those groups. And I told the leadership at that time, I said, "Look, we can do this, but doesn't mean that you can actually use this genetic data in court. There's no real precedence for you doing that from a research project." But they wanted to do it anyway. They felt that would be at least a start in the direction to do it to be done. So I did the testing on about close to 100 and something individuals who themselves or their family members were on the rolls of these groups. I mean, I've seen pictures that folks had of their family members who were like in leadership. Like, for instance, one woman, her grandfather, his name was Billy Bowleg. He was a Seminole chief at one point, and she's African American, part of the black freedmen. So some of her family members were tested. And so when the results came back, I went back out there, and for the most part, there was very little Native American ancestry. Now, there were about 4 or 5 individuals, African Americans, who had over 30% Native American ancestry, and who had significant, Native American ancestry. But for the most part, most of the African Americans had just as much or less than the average African American.